Good morning and welcome to today's panel, American White Supremacist Leaders and the State of the Modern Neo-Nazi Movement, hosted by the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. My name is Haru Ingram. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at the program, and I'll be moderating what promises to be an excellent panel. Our panelists for today are Dr. Manuela Chiani, who is an Associate Professor in Political Science at the Scuola Normale Superiore and an affiliated scholar at the Cosmos Center for Social Movement Studies. We also have Alexander Ritzman, Senior Advisor at the Counter-Extremism Project, and of course our own John Lewis, Research Fellow at the Program on Extremism. The full bios of our speakers will appear in the chat now. The other purpose of today's panel is to launch the program's latest report, Founding Fathers of the Modern American Neo-Nazi Movement, the Impacts and Legacies of Louis Beam, William Luther Pierce, and James Mason. And this report was produced thanks to our partnership with the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology and Education Center, or NSITE, a US Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence. Now, a link has just been posted in the Zoom chat for those listening live, but the report can also be found on the Program on Extremism homepage or Twitter account. Finally, some quick notes on the format of today's event. We will begin with opening remarks from each of our panelists of about 10 minutes before we move to a discussion between the panelists and then get you, our listeners, involved as the panelists will answer your questions. Now, please don't wait until the end to submit your questions. Use the chat function to submit your questions as soon as they come to mind. We almost always run out of time during our panel, so first in, first served is usually the best rule. On that note, we're going to open today's event with the primary author of the report that we're launching today, John Lewis. Over to you. Thank you.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Very excited to be joined in this panel by some excellent scholars, and very excited to talk through the report, the findings, and I think most importantly, compare and contrast a bit from the American landscape over into the European landscape. So, as Harara said, this report is really aimed at identifying the key drivers of charismatic American leadership in far-right movements. This is a follow-on from a report Harara and I authored several years ago, also for NSITE, which examined the impact, legacy, and specific life narratives of 3 jihadist American leaders. And we try to take the same tack for this report by looking through and examining historically who some of the most significant figures in this landscape may have been. As Harara said, we identified, of course, Louis Beam, William Luther Pierce, and James Mason. And I think that starting there is obviously the best point here in seeing through an examination of the lives and the life narratives, most importantly, seeing how each of these individuals developed, both as individuals and also as key figures in these movements. And when we trace the life of Louis Beam, for example, and we see his actions in Vietnam, we see him come home, and then we see him engage in this campaign of racism, this leadership in the Klan, this movement to the Aryan nations, and then this engagement with some of the more modern elements of this landscape. We really see both how they are impacted and also how they then themselves impact what was in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, a burgeoning and interconnected white supremacist movement. And I think that really when we look at that period in time, what I think is most striking when Harara and I were working through the primary source texts is just how interconnected so many of these individuals were. When you look, for example, at the interplay and relationships between some of the Aryan Nations figures, Louis Beam, the members of the Order led by Robert Matthews in that period, each of whom were reading William Luther Pierce's Turner Diaries as it's coming out. I think, that's something that, some phenomenal scholars to date have really been identifying is the interconnectedness, right? Kathleen Belew always makes that excellent argument. There really are no lone wolves. These are all, foot soldiers in what is and has been and will continue likely to be a fairly interconnected, homogenous white supremacist movement. And so as we look at the evolution of Louis Beam, of William Luther Pierce, and then of James Mason, there are these similarities that really do crop up, right? Obviously, both their personal connections to each other, but also their influences. When you look at James Mason, for example, you see him engaging both with some of the more traditional elements of white supremacy, but then also looking outside of the movement itself, and you see him seeking, white supremacist death metal over in Europe. You see him seeking out Charles Manson and his helter-skelter ideology, which I think really sits at the forefront in that period of what we would later identify as really being one of the early drivers of accelerationism in the United States, most specifically. And as we really shape and contextualize the evolution of these charismatic figures, what I think is most striking and where I think we tried to focus the thrust of this report is really into the lasting impact and enduring legacy of these figures. I think that when you situate these individuals in this pantheon of American white supremacy, that there really are a few others that had such an outsized role both during their lives and then obviously after their death, especially in the case of Pierce, who passed away at the turn of the century. But what you really see, of course, individuals like George Lincoln Rockwell, Joseph Tomasi, and then Manson, who did play a role in influencing these figures. What you really see are that these three do stand out in terms of their ability, largely in the case of Mason and Pierce, through their texts, through their primary source texts, through their authorship of the Turner Diaries and Siege, respectively, which really serve as cornerstones, as Bibles, as some scholars have said, of this modern iteration of the white supremacist movement. And I think that what is really most challenging, fascinating, and I think significant here is the fact that when you look at this modern, neo-fascist accelerationist movement that currently exists in the U.S. today, what you really see is one that is driven by and painted in the image of all three of the individuals that we profiled here. They pick up and engage with the leaderless resistance tactic of Louis Beam. They recognize the failings of these homogenous hierarchical organizations in the US in the 70s and 80s. They see these groups like the Klan get sued out of existence by these crippling civil lawsuits. They see the targeting of leaders by domestic law enforcement. And they recognize in this modern age with the internet and social media that they don't need a physical meeting space. They don't need a headquarters. They don't need a roster, membership list. And I think that really does serve as one of the kind of key elements of this modern landscape today. And I think that when you kind of pair that up with the texts, Turner Diaries and Siege, what you really see are a set of movements that have embraced those wholeheartedly, that have picked up the race war rhetoric in Turner Diaries, that have picked up the love for graphic violence and the accelerationist core of Siege, which was really disregarded in real time as it was being written by Mason in the 70s and 80s, and have made that a cornerstone of what they have really made as a movement today. And I think that's, as we talk about kind of the policy implications and we kind of speak to some of the lasting impact of this movement, I think that's what's probably most striking is the threat posed by lone actors and small groups of individuals who are motivated by this very specific neo-fascist accelerationist ideology. We see when Atomwaffen Division and the base emerged into prominence several years ago, Atomwaffen in particular, they make pilgrimages effectively out to James Mason's residence in Colorado. they have him serving as almost this spiritual advisor, this elder statesman of the movement, despite the fact, again, that in the 70s and 80s, his contemporaries ignored him. His texts were not really viewed with a significant amount of respect. But what we see today really is this movement that has embraced siege culture. When we look at the transnational elements, especially, what you see is a movement that is born out of these online spaces like Iron March, a movement which is driven by a central desire to collapse the system. Again, something very reminiscent that we see in Turner Diaries, right? And we see this singular desire by this movement to engage in violence offline, to not just talk about it online, but then mobilize in furtherance of these ideas and concepts offline. And I think that when we really take that step back and examine the legacy and impact of these three figures, I think what's most significant is their ability to continue, years and years and years later, to drive individuals to violence, to have these core central texts which continue to radicalize and inspire others. And obviously, in the case of Beam, this concept, this leaderless resistance, which, as we see today, is still able to serve as one of the central kind of post-organizational concepts that we see in this landscape today. So I will leave it there. Very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, John. We'll move straight away actually to Alex with his reflections and also his insights from the European context. Over to you, Alex. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this interesting discussion. Good afternoon from Berlin. As some of you know, I'm with the Counter Extremism Project, where we do a lot of things. My focus is on the transnational, violent, right-wing extremist scene, network, milieus, mostly European and US connections. I'm going to share a little presentation with you. Now, my focus here is basically to add different strategies to the ones that are outlined in the report by these godfathers, if you want, of neo-Nazism in the United States, by introducing two new leaders, two very recent leaders who are currently, in a way, flourishing and making their progress in very different ways. So some of you, maybe all of you, know these two. On the left, that's Robert Rundo. That's an American citizen born in Queens, who started the Rise Above movement. And after having significant issues with the FBI, he appears to be traumatized from some 3 o'clock in the morning raids, came up with this idea of presenting a friendly face to violent right-wing extremism, to beautify REMV combat sports, basically, a sort of Californication approach. He moved to California, where RAM was started, and currently there's this network called Active Clubs, which appears to be just a bunch of white men working out and practicing mixed martial arts. So that's one. And the other guy is Denis Nikitin. His real name is Kapustin. I'm going to switch between the two to keep you on your toes. He is a Russian national who moved to Germany as a teenager with his family, a football hooligan who then moved back to Russia and became maybe the dominant Russian right-wing extremist combat sports organizer, with big events, international networking. I would say he is the white supremacist godfather on the European continent, active, organizing. Now, he ran into trouble, of course, and then retreated into Ukraine in 2017, where he started building up his own network, his own organization. Now, Robert Rundo and him, these two were in Germany. That's where Rundo met Nikitin at the Kampf der Nibelungen, Struggle Combat of the Nibelungs, combat sports event, the biggest German network, which is also very well connected to all European member states and way beyond. So this was an initializing moment where young Rando would meet a little older Nikitin to learn how to organize combat sports and white supremacist strategies in a different way. And this is how this looks like. It is the Californication of combat sports. They try to look pretty, sexy, attractive. They try to bring in more people because traditionally, right-wing extremist combat sports is a bunch of bulky guys beating each other up. So this is attractive to a couple of people, but you're not going to get big numbers. So the white supremacist 3.0 strategy developed by Robert Rando says we need to look less aggressive and more approachable. And on the other hand, we have Denis Nikitin, who is currently the leader of the Russian volunteer corps in Ukraine. You have heard of him for sure, the group at least. This is a volunteer group, military battalion comprised of Russian nationals who fight against Putin from Ukrainian territory. And he is the actual leader of this group which has invaded Russia 3 times. In March, in May, and just recently in June. So this is the militarization of that same network. So we have a mainstreaming, trying to bring in new people, looking attractive and nice. And the other movement is having access, battle experience, access to military weapons, obviously. So this is a game changer in this transnational combat network, and that's some of the work that I've been doing with the Counter-Extremism Project and also with Johns Hopkins University, the American-German Institute, where I just was for a research fellowship. At CEP, we've been looking at these structures, transnational combat sports and, or let's say, transnational right-wing extremist and terrorism networks, organizations, hubs, activities since 2020. The German Federal Foreign Office commissioned us to do that. And since then, we've done a couple of course, follow-up activities looking into the Western extremists who went to Ukraine, also who fight on the Russian side, of course, Russian right-wing extremists or European right-wing extremists fighting on the Russian side. We are concerned with managing the return. So a lot of people here have worked on Islamist extremism, the Islamic State. In general, the West, or basically everyone, was very late realizing that a lot of the foreign fighters were returning, the families and so on. So we've been trying to initiate this process in the EU regarding the war in Ukraine, against Ukraine by Russia. And we also work on the linkages between right-wing extremism and organized crime. So this is a little bit to show you how we are looking at these guys and also how we came up at presenting them to you this way. So this is what's happening in a little more detail. So on the one hand, you have the mainstreaming strategy. Only the pretty boys are allowed to be in the videos, right? And the guys who are not in shape have to work to earn the right to be displayed in the videos of the active clubs. That is the strategy, not always implemented, but the strategy. On the other hand, this is Denis Nikitin Kapustin posing in front of a Russian postal office in March 2023. So this is the 2 guys. This is how they used to have combat sports events in Russia. White Rex, this is the brand of Denis Nikitin. The 2 of them have a very interesting podcast that is still active. Well, not active because Rando is has been arrested in April, but this was a very interesting source of information. Active clubs have been popping up in the US. There's at least, I would say 40 that I'm aware of in about 20 states. So this is a growing phenomenon. There was just a call in the last days for Proud Boys who are upset with their respective organization to join the active clubs to have some real action going on. And then, of course, we have Denis Nikitin. This is from the summer last year, where he was posing in Ukraine and asking people to join him and join the fight against Putin. Right, so this is the one side of the development. Then we have the European a combat sports network in the middle. That's a guy that's a German guy. On the left side, that's a Polish guy who fights for France, for the French right-wing extremists. On the right side, there's an Hungarian. They just did a tournament in Budapest in May this year. This is a picture of a French fighter, member of an active club in France, sending this picture from the front. This is an active club in Estonia who is collecting money to support the fighters fighting in the war. And there's also a German battalion associated with that. So you can see there's a lot going on. There's German right-wing extremists who sell the merchandise of the White Rex brand from Nikitin. And of course, the German Combat Sports Network sells the merchandise of the Active Club, despite the fact that this guy on top is also wearing Active Club merchandise. This is just to show you that there's a lot going on. And this is just from, I think, 2 days ago. You might have heard of the Blood Tribe Ohio. That's an explicit neo-Nazi group. On the banner, it reads, "There will be blood." And they just announced that they're going to travel to Ukraine and to join Denis Nikitin in his fight. I'm not sure if that is true. They're collecting money. It's the leader, you see him, the bold guy, big mouth, of course, but they just announced, because of the success, I guess, because of all the reputation, that they're going to move from the US to Ukraine to fight with Denis Nikitin / Kapustin. This is not an active club, though, right? This is just a development that connects. So this is not obviously the mainstreaming with looking scary and giving the Hitler salute. So these are two leaders. This is some collage someone did on the left. Denis Nikitin, hero of our race. And then, of course, Robert Rando was arrested in Romania in early April. He has been to prison as a 17-year-old for almost 2 years for a knife fight with, he says, MS-13 members in Queens, where he's from, New York. He learned everything he knows about history in prison. He joined a white supremacist network there. So for him, going to prison, I would say, is like going to university, because he's never been to university. He has no formal education I'm aware of, except for a high school degree. Everything he learned was in prison and through activism, and by following his role model, Denis Nikitin. Just to finish off here, this is an international network, these active clubs who do combat sports and working out and presenting the friendly face of right-wing extremism combat sports. At least that's the strategy. It's not always successful. Netherlands, 6 of them in France, Sweden, Finland, Croatia, Estonia, Latvia, Germany, 11 chapters in Canada, UK, Ireland, and so on. And just to finish, finally, these are solidarity actions calling for the setting free of Robert Rando after his arrest. On the very left, that's from Russia. Center is Sweden. On the right, that's the Netherlands. Left bottom is Canada, and right bottom is France. And yeah, there's going to be papers and webinars coming up, so stay tuned. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. And finally, Manuela, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, I will have something to upload. And yes, it is the correct one. Okay, first of all, can you hear me? Can you hear me quite well, or shall
yes, loud and clear. Very good.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to thank, of course, the organizers of this great panel, and also the colleague who just talked before me, since he gave also to me the occasion to enter into the debate with a great background of information and really a very timely data. And I don't know if my presentation is okay, full screen, or let me wait. Okay, So what I would like to discuss with you is something probably a bit less based on data, although I also would like to present to you a current project I am involved in, which is called Outlive Neo-Authoritarianism in Europe, and in which I am focusing on work package number 7, which is exactly on the transnationalization of extreme right activism among European countries, but also taking into account Russian American influences. And so this is why when listening to Alexander was wonderful to me to see a clear examples and instances of what we are just searching and investigating. But beyond this Outlive, on which if you want I can give you more details later, I would like to offer also some conceptual tools where these instances of transnationalization, these cases can be located, and also through which they can be interpreted. And so just to, again, very quickly, I would like to propose what we are also conducting at the Scuola Normale Superiore, what we are carrying on as research at the Scuola Normale Superiore, where I am based, and within our Cosmos Research Center for the study of social movement and political participation, those of us who are focusing on the extreme right instead of progressive and left-wing movement, the idea which could give us also important analytical tools to reflect on the mechanism and the why and the conditions under which also biographies, single biographies, as we have just saw, can transnationalize and also be carrier of transnationalization of the meso-organizational level. So in our view, these concepts are very nicely located within the literature of social movements and protests. So the first idea I would like to launch, let's say, is to conceive the radical right and right-wing activists according to, let's say, a social movement approach. So what does it mean? It means to reflect on political and discursive opportunities rather than social threat or anomic behavior. It means to empirically organize our research in order to understand what are the organizational resources of these individuals and groups, rather than just what are the grievances, why they mobilize or they can be active. But also it means to focus and to emphasize, as we do actually as a social movement scholars very often for the other side of the coin, as we do for the progressive ones, to emphasize the agency and agencies of these actors, namely to focus not only on the actions, which can be transnational, so the co-organization of one event, which can be cultural, political, not only on the real networks, organizational networks and ties, but also in a more subtle ways, focusing on the agencies would mean also to emphasize the frames, so the cognitive schemes through which they symbolically construct the social and political reality, within which actually their action, individual and collective, can be located. And this is also, and the third point of this approach is to look at the repertoire of action of extreme right activism today, instead of just vote on the one hand and violence on the other. So also coming from social movement studies, again, which usually is an approach applied to the left-wing ones, but the idea of repertoire of action allows us as researchers to conceive a much broader variety of actions, which can be included actually within the label political action. They go from online to private, also private actions, I mean, also cultural and symbolic and many others. kind of action. So said that, so networks probably is one of the most important concepts, no? And these networks can be grasped today through at least three let me say elements or mechanisms. They can be organizational networks, they can be networks of issues and frames, and they can be networks across events. And so what I would like to show you here is quickly some results which derive from a project which I conducted some time ago, but which still is a sort of ongoing project, constantly updated. And the project is based on the role of the web for the radical right organization for the identity formation, which for us, from social movement studies, come before the activation. So before you need to create a collective identity. And then organizational contact, national, but also transnational, and finally mobilization, online and offline. And this project was actually based, as you can see, on some Western European countries, some Eastern and Central European countries, and also the United States. It was a project focusing on what? On the activism online, a kind of activism which, as you can see here, was disentangled in several aspects. No? One of them was, of course, the idea, which is the main focus of today, so the interest of today, transnational contact, transnationalization. But once again, I want to insist on the fact that, in my view, the transnationalization and diffusion phenomena need to be understood in a more nuanced way. So transnationalization can be articulated in transnationalization of organizations, but also of just frames and issues and or action. And also the mechanism can be various. There can be transnationalization from above, when right-wing political parties and their leaders actually set with their co-organized event, they set the so-called political opportunities and discursive opportunities also for the transnationalization of the middle level activists and the grassroots movement. But there can also be a transnationalization directly from below, and also especially from by biographies, as we have seen in the instances which the colleague put forward. So in this project, probably the most important, it was a project based on social network analysis, based on online links, according to a very strong definition, a strict definition of links. For us, links were not just hyperlinks from one extreme right website to another, or like or tweet and retweet, but it was a very strong and strict definition of links. For us, there were a link between two organizations, two extreme right organizations, or better, their organizational websites, when the organization were referring to each other in the page like my friends, my partners. And therefore could define all these on the basis of a list of hundreds and hundreds of organizations in the United States and many Western European countries, and many, as you see, Central and Western, Eastern European, and could define all these online links. We have been able to reconstruct these communities. So the network of the extreme right communities online in each country. And so thanks to social network analysis measure, we have been able to analyze these networks in terms of who are the central extreme right actors. Are they neo-Nazi? Are they political parties? So is there the more institutional version of the iceberg, central? Who are the peripheral? Who play a role of broker, putting together sectors of the movement, of the overall milieu of the radical right in a country, which would have been otherwise separated? This is a very important point for demobilization. And these networks, I insist, they are organizational networks. So nothing to do with the individual transnationalization that we were talking about, but it is important as a background. This organizational network can be the output of the individual biographical overlapping and networking that we saw before, or can be also the cause, the factor which favor the individual transnationalization also by leaders. And so we reflected a lot on the using several measures of social network analysis on the prominence and peripherality of different organizations, but also we reflected a lot on the overall shape of the network. Look, the shape of the United States, the extreme right community in the United States is, or better was, because this data come back to some years, a very decentralized network, very horizontal, with also many isolated nodes. And these isolated nodes are organizations, but they are also individuals. And this is very much linked to the phenomena of, on the one hand, when talking about political violence, of the lonely wolves, but also, this is also very much linked to the idea of transnationalization between extreme right communities, which is carried out by individuals, by leaders and or activists, much more than by organizations. And finally, just the last slides, we also counted the international and cross-national ties of the extreme right organizations in each country. So how often they were in their websites connecting themselves with other extreme right organizations in other countries, or transnational organizations, like can be the organization we saw before, the, I don't know, the Christian identity, I don't know, the identitarians, no, which have branches in many European countries and also United States, or other, the Storefront and many other international extreme right organizations. Well, as you can see here, 1/3 of hundreds and hundreds organizations of the extreme right that we coded, 1/3 of them contains actually extreme cross-national links. So they use the website, and again, I want to stress, we only focus on the website. So a very also old tool of be present online. Currently, such a study should be reproduced using Facebook, Twitter, and all the Telegram, all the social media outlets at disposal. However, this study conducted on the websites and their referencing, reciprocal referencing in the page, my partner, my friends, actually allowed it also us to have a proxy, which was a quite close proxy of ideological closeness, and also potential for collaboration outside, because it was much more, let's say, committing, no? To say, yes, this is my partner. So 1/3. And as you see, the United States, together with the Italians, were the extreme right, more internationally oriented. We also integrated this data with several interviews that we did in the United States, but also in all these other extreme European countries with representatives of the extreme right organizations. Of course, it goes without saying that for us, it was much easier to have an interview with more institutionalized groups than with the more violent and more subcultural, almost underground groups. By the way, the interviews that we did, and that where we asked about the role of the internet for their internationalization, of course, they did confirm in any country, any type of organization, that the internet, broadly speaking, social media, website, it is particularly important for this transnationalization, not only in terms of activities. So let's have a meeting in Frankfurt among skinheads, but also in terms of communication. So what we saw, what I said at the beginning, in terms of frames exchange of repertoire of actions. And so I want to stop here by saying that, for instance, a clear example of these changes and this diffusion among extreme right actors transnationally is also very well visible, for instance, today in Europe in the use of humor and irony, like the memes, in their websites in order to propagate ideology and propaganda. This is a typical repertoire of action of the radical right in the United States, the alt-right. It was almost unknown until recently, let's say. It was not a practice for the extreme right in Europe. Well, currently, this practice is increasing in the extreme right in Europe. And the same can be said for several frames, like, for instance, the importance of the way religion and anti-gender issues are framed together, something that, again, look like be imported by the United States, by the extreme right in the United States, be imported by some extreme rights in Europe, like the French one, for which it was not like the tradition to do like that. So much more focused on other kind of issues and bridging among the issues. So what I want to say here, and I stop, is that, of course, it is extremely important to trace the organizational links, but it is also extremely important to trace, and this is also the difficulty of the social research today, to trace what can precede these links. So the idea of diffusion of ideas and frames and same cognitive schemes to interpret similar situations and also to propose similar solutions. This is our, let's say, future, in my view, main challenge, because of course it is much more difficult to trace the diffusion of ideas than eventually the overlapping links between organizations and the leaders. Thank you. I'll stop here. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Manuela. Excellent. I think it's time for us now to quickly shift into a discussion, I guess, between the panelists, and then we'll kind of just transition into the questions that have been provided by our listeners today. I guess I should start with John. You know, the report, of course, looks at the influence and the legacy of Beam, Pierce, and Mason. But if you had to select one of those as having the most impact, I know this is, I guess, a bit of a silly question to ask, but I am interested that if you had to choose one as the most impactful of the three, who would it be and why?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we were talking about this maybe at the turn of the century or in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing, it would likely be Pierce, just simply due to how prominent and widespread the Churn Diaries had become in that period of time. Timothy McVeigh was, going from gun show to gun show, selling it. It had become truly the Bible of the radical right in the United States in that period, because it told this lightly fictionalized story of a future that many of the prominent individuals, ideologues, and organizations in this milieu had been warning about and in some cases fantasizing about for decades. I think what has transpired in the past 10, 15 years or so, and I think a lot of what Alexander spoke to, I think highlights this in the transnational space, is the growth of what I think many have begun to frame as siege culture really does situate Mason as the most prominent figure. And again, I think a lot of this does come down to the situation, right? Pierce, when he passed away at the turn of the century, he was the leader of the largest white supremacist organization in the country, the National Alliance. That was, by all accounts, that was the monolithic organization that had survived this kind of life organizational death of many of those groups in the aftermath of Oklahoma City. And so, as Louis Beam fades into obscurity, in the aftermath of the Fort Smith sedition trial, as William Pierce dies and his organization fades, in the early 2000s, Mason really, by process of elimination, becomes the only significant ideologue from that period who remains both active and whose message I think still resonates. And I think that's really what sets him apart. And I think why, in this period now, he has to be viewed as the most significant because of the revitalization of Siege itself, of this kind of renewed fascination by this young core of largely American, but obviously, transnational English-speaking neo-Nazis who, really came up in that Iron March and then later Fascist Forge, online forum space, who became obsessed with the concepts and the tenets of Mason's magazine, which obviously was turned into a book later on. And so I think that when you look at, the most prominent manifestations of the neo-fascist space today, they're of course, motivated to some extent by many of the narratives and grievances that emerged in Turner Diaries. They follow tactically and strategically the concepts laid out by Beam in Leaderless Resistance, but most prominently at this point today has to be Mason because of his dual kind of role there as elder statesman and also ideologue that continues to drive him forward.
Yeah, which I think kind of then within the context of what Alex spoke about, it does beg the question, the differences between, the old school, if you want, what John was referring to, and Alex, I guess what we could call the new school of right-wing extremist leaders. What do you see as the similarities and differences between, I guess, that generation and this generation? And I suppose I should remain consistent and ask a kind of a silly question. What about their staying power? I mean, John's kind of spoken quite a bit about the ongoing influence and legacy. Something I'm particularly interested in is posthumous legacy and influence. I wonder what you think about their staying power.
Yeah, that's a good question. So they're both in their 30s, right? So Brando is in his early 30s and Nikitin is either late 30s or early 40s. So these are basically young men. Rando has definitely studied the three guys that you have present in that very interesting, informative report. And has come to a different conclusion as others have, like Atomwaffen Division, the whole siege culture, accelerationists. I would say that Rando and the Active Club strategy, White Supremacy 3.0, are not trying to build on the experiences, but rather learn from them of what not to do. So they try to put a friendly face to right-wing extremism. There will be in the strategy, no swastikas. On Hitler's birthday, April 20th, there might be a wink to happy birthday, Uncle A. Dot. But that's it, right? So there will be, if you would ask them, they would probably say we're not neo-Nazis. We are defenders of the white race. We are in the Great Replacement, the white genocide, and these overarching threat narratives that claim that there's a worldwide conspiracy to eliminate the white race. They are organizing the resistance in Active Clubs would say in a peaceful way, and Nikitin would obviously say we are ready to fight. So this is similarities and differences. I found very interesting that you applied the CIP model, the charismatic ideology, pragmatic model. And I would say that Rando is a talker, right? So he has not published anything, but he has dozens of podcasts and interviews. So he's spreading the ideology by talking and not so much doing. He just gave everybody a do-it-yourself toolkit to organize the local right-wing extremism, sporty, combat-oriented, feeling like they belong to a big army, a shadow army, but on the other hand, being independent. which is also harder to infiltrate and combat by law enforcement, right? So that is, I think it is a lesson learned from being too confrontational, too aggressive. Quoting Siege and Turner diaries will bring the FBI, right? If you do that too much. So that's why they might read it and maybe take parts of it, but they will not celebrate them. This is my understanding of the white supremacy 3.0. And Denis Nikitin is not talking a lot. He's just doing, constantly organizing events. He's a good speaker. He's a very good propagandist, but he's showing through deeds what white supremacy today can be. So these are different approaches, but they connect, of course, to your research.
So I think that now that we've kind of started by talking about the impact of individuals, Manuela, what was so kind of perfect about your presentation in the context of the first two speakers was that larger macro view and the kind of network analysis that you and your team have done. I particularly like that. You've shown how in the US, milieu, it's quite decentralized, and then demonstrated those trends in transnational links that kind of characterized Europe, but also that broader global milieu. I guess, given all the research that you have done into these networks, which country has the greatest influence on the transnational dynamics? Is there a particular country that stands out in terms of its influence on others? And if so, I guess why? Who is it? And
okay, thank you a lot. And unfortunately, I didn't get very clearly everything, but so I can try to react on the basis of what I understood. So thank you for the question, since it gives me also the opportunity to go on in the reflection. And it is always difficult in political science and sociology to answer a black and white answer, no? Either concerning the past or even more concerning the future. So who will be the most active actor? So I can answer to your question in proposing some ideas of interpretation on the basis of the research I have been conducted so far. The first idea is that what I see is that there are some political and cultural opportunities in some European countries or in some European extreme rights, which can be more conducive for the transnationalization of their activists, sympathizers, and leaders. So, for instance, it is not, of course, it is under, all of us know that the French and the Italian extreme rights have been traditionally also oriented internationally, no? And they also have had linkages in the past and influences, cultural influences among them. So I would say there are also some historical opportunities which set the cultural milieu in a country for these forces that can be more conducive or hamper, on the contrary, the transnationalization. So for sure, within the European panorama, the French and the Italian extreme rights, both at the institutional level and at the cultural, subcultural milieu level, have a fertile, let me say, fertile terrain for transnationalization. So it is not something so extraneous to the culture of the political right, of the extreme right. At the same time, it is important to say that, and this is also I'm strongly convinced about that, the extreme right, until recently, since it was, especially also in Europe, but in America, in the United States as well, very much focused on some components of the ideological core values, which were nationalism and immigration. These components have been hampering, so to say, the transnationalization, the move toward a great transnationalization of these forces, because it was like a sort of contradiction. Think about in terms of political parties of the extreme right, which you see today are particularly important in Europe, but they have been also very important in previous American presidential elections. So how can you create an European party of the radical right among leaders, while at the same time, at the national level, you are, for instance, considering, when coming to immigration issues, some immigrants from Eastern and Central European countries as your main enemies. So immigrants from the same countries with whose leader you are going to create an European formation. So this was a contradiction for the radical right. Currently, however, the radical right, and then I jump to your question, to your answer. The radical right is moving toward more rewarding topics. Also the European radical rights, which are anti-gender, religion, and the bridging of all the new issues in a way that, in my view, can really favor now finally the transnationalization. First of all, at the level of political parties, which in my view remain the institutional channel also for the transnationalization, but also those who set again, the discursive opportunities. So let me put it in another way. When Giorgia Meloni, the leader of Fratelli d'Italia and the leader of the Italy Today, was very frequently meeting the newborn and increasingly successful radical right party, Spanish one, Vox. And they were meeting them quite frequently in the past. Actually, in my view, they were setting together, in terms of leadership, they were setting the milieu, within which also extreme right activists and sympathizers can feel more comfortable in addressing each other across those two countries, just to put an example. So in terms of influences, what I see for sure is that the American extreme right currently is increasingly influencing the European one in many directions. And the religious and anti-gender topics are one of these directions. So not only repertoire of action, as I said before, like the use of cartoon and memes, which was something extraneous to the European right until recently, and now it is fundable in various social media outlets, but also in terms of changing the silence of some issues. Yeah, so this is what they are educated guess so far, more than real results. But my current Outlib project, within which I work together with other 7 European institutions, among which the Central European University. So we are a group of Eastern and Central European and West European partners. We are focusing exactly in the work package I lead on this, the transnationalization of the extreme right at the level of elites, but also grassroots activists, and the influences from the United States and Russia. And so in few years, let's say in 2 years, if we organize a new panel on that, I will be able to provide more results than just educated guess. Thank you.
Great, thank you. John, we've got a question here from the audience. I know you don't stuck talking about the Roxbar de Mason for too much longer, but it is an interesting question about these inflection points in, I guess, his trajectory and his level of influence. Could you reflect on some of those points? And I guess more broadly, talk to us about legitimacy in this movement, and feel free to refer to any other individuals as well, that given some of the appalling backgrounds of these people, you'd assume by anyone's standard, how they're able to attain legitimacy.
Yeah, absolutely. So with respect to Mason, I think by most, if not all accounts, by the time you hit 2000, 2005, 2010, he's, when you look at the reporting on him, he's described as, this washed up, dried up has-been neo-Nazi who, effectively has been left behind by the traditional white supremacist movement of Pierce, of Beam, who has kind of wandered off into the wilderness of Helter Skelter, and Charles Manson, and kind of then obviously had his own legal troubles, charged and arrested and charged with child sex acts, and then in and out of prison for most of the 1990s. Where I think you see that inflection point is the kind of packaging and republishing of Siege by Michael Moynihan, who's a white supremacist, musician, journalist, in some extent, who has a publishing house in I believe around 2009, 2010, who picks up, engages with Siege, which in its original format was just this kind of collection of texts, this journal effectively written by Mason. He kind of picks it up, collates it, edits it, gives it a foreword, and then publishes it through his publishing house, Storm Books. And I think that at that specific point in time, for a number of societal, cultural, ideological reasons, it begins to resonate with this new generation of young American white supremacists, right? Again, this is a time, we're sitting here, they're 10 years on from the turn of the century, 20 change on from the Oklahoma City bombing, and no one has really come to the forefront in that period who has been viewed as legitimate, right? There are very few individuals who are using effective propaganda to radicalize and recruit individuals to this very specific cross-section of neo-fascist accelerationism, driven by a desire to engage in this very, very graphic violence. I think that when you look at the evolution of Siege, of Siege culture, you do have obviously that significant transnational element in Iron March, which was effectively, again, this closed forum that was designed to serve as an incubator for individuals to become steeped in Siege culture, right? It was effectively required reading for Atomwaffen Division and its kind of other nodes in that network. And I think all of that really did serve to push Mason back into the limelight effectively. And I think that when we talk about legitimacy, I think, of course, many of these individuals have, a twisted sense of what legitimacy and I think, deification in this space looks like. But I think when we do look at that, what it really does speak to is the prominence of that propaganda of the deed, right? This deification, this martyrdom concept that obviously has its roots in a lot of the Salafi jihadist spaces, but has become really one of the core pillars of that neo-fascist accelerationist space. It's this literal deification of the mass shooters, right? The Breiviks, the Tarrants, and then obviously the spate of American shooters in El Paso and Poway and Pittsburgh and Buffalo, who to their own specific extents appear to have been motivated obviously by their embrace of these white supremacist anti-Semitic conspiracies and narratives, and their embrace of this specific neo-fascist accelerationist kind of strand, but who are also to some extent driven by a desire to gain entrance to that pantheon of saints, right? I think in a time where, as Alexander laid out quite well, you have these more mainstream or kind of figures like Rundo who are trying to put a nicer face on what American fascism, what kind of Californication of white supremacy could look like in this country. You still do have this very kind of fringe element, this kind of very specific strand, which is still kind of driven by that core desire to engage in that significant act of violence to not just become a martyr, become a sainted figure, but then to inspire the next individual, to create the conditions for the next 4chan user, the next, young neo-Nazi to think, decide that enough is enough and they have to go follow in their footsteps. And so, I think that in this present space, the legitimacy is obviously given from the top down, from those ideologues who, again, as we've seen, are now few and far between, the Masons, the Rundos. But now I think increasingly from the bottom up, we're seeing a lot of these individuals rise to the forefront through their violence and through that propaganda of the deed.
There's a lot of questions coming through at the moment on Ukraine and Russia. So I suppose it's only fair that we turn to our European panelists to ask them about the influence of that war, the Russian invasion, on I guess the far-right extremist movement. Alex, let's start with you. There's been a couple of questions here about the alignment of the values and goals and principles of these violent extremist groups and them joining certain sides of the war over others, whether it's the Ukraine or Russia. You've received a specific question there in the chat about certain individuals. Could you just reflect, I suppose, on your findings? That how do these different groups and networks, but even individuals, justify who they join, why, and how it aligns with their broader goals?
Right. So the war originally started in 2014, right? So this is when Russia annexed parts of Ukraine, claiming there were Russian-speaking, Russian cultural citizens under attack. The basic approach of Putin, he tried this in Georgia and other places. Since then, this gave a push to the transnational violent extreme right. So from 2014 to until last year, on the second phase, until the full invasion, actually these guys were prospering, the right-wing extremists. There were meetings everywhere, festivals, music festivals, combat sports events, huge marches, strategy meetings where the Russian imperial movement would meet with the Azov movement, so Russians and Ukrainians in Germany, to discuss strategy, despite the fact that some of these groups were currently shooting at each other in those parts in the Donbas region of Ukraine, right? So they were very pragmatic. They were saying there's a transnational threat against the white race, so we have to overcome our hyper-nationalism. We have to fight united against a bigger threat. Now, the second phase of this war has destroyed basically all of that. There's a lot of infighting now in the extreme right because everybody had to pick a side. Are you with the Russians or are you with the Ukrainians? And this has had the death threats within the community now for people who are too pro-Putin or too pro-Ukraine and all. So overall, I would say this has been weakening the transnational right-wing extremist scenes for now. But of course, it gave people like Kapustin, Nikitin, the opportunity to attract people and train them, bring them into combat and build a new network. Now, at the moment, there are Russians fighting against Putin on the Ukrainian side, and there are some European right-wing extremists fighting on Putin's side against Ukraine. So this is fog of war, right? So there's a little reporting. These guys have a pretty good operational security. So it's very different from the Islamic State days where the foreign fighters are basically live streaming over Facebook. They're traveling, what they're doing, the crimes they were committing. There's actually very little communication of all the foreigners that are fighting on both sides, on the Russian side and on the Ukrainian side. Now, the question was asking why the Russian volunteer corps would attack Russia, why the Ukrainians would allow that. My understanding of the Ukrainians is that they fight for survival and they accept everyone who can contribute damaging the Russian attack, halting it, confusing it. So good luck reporting in Russia that there's a Russian volunteer battalion invading Russia from Ukraine. So that is a PSYOPs operation for me. This is psychological warfare. This actually happened. But the Ukrainians let this happen because it is damaging Putin's narrative that he is denazifying Germany and all that stuff, which is a lie. Our colleague just posted an article I wrote on that topic in the chat for everyone who's interested in the propaganda lie and some of the facts related to where are neo-Nazis and what the problem really is. So this is, I think, Ukraine is currently accepting anyone who has military training, is able to fight, and they don't mind if there's a swastika tattoo on the shoulder, right? Later on, I'm very convinced the Ukrainians will clean up and kick these guys out, while the Russians, I don't know what they're going to do, right? There's the Russian Imperial Legion, there is the Rusich Battalion, there are neo-Nazis fighting on the Russian side. So there are neo-Nazis on both sides fighting against each other. I know that I'm not explaining this, that it makes everything clearer. I'm explaining this to show the complexity. Sorry for that.
No, I mean, these are very, very valuable points that you're making. I guess, Manuela, could you reflect on some of these dynamics? I mean, how do you see war in Europe impacting, I guess, the future of the far-right extremist threat in Europe and the world more broadly? What impact will the war have?
Yes, and for sure, the COVID, the Ukrainian-Russia war can be conceptualized, again, coming back to some analytical tools that can help us to understand the changes, the dynamics in the radical right, can be conceptualized with the concept of critical juncture. So some sudden and very quick changes that in this case have been provoked by a war, but before it was a critical juncture, the emergency, the pandemic. So big changes which somehow empower some actors and narratives and frames and disempower, not suddenly, some other actors and narratives. So honestly, here I would stick on what Alexander just said. And I don't have many more reflections to propose, if not the fact that, in my view, always the international changes, in this case, the presence of this war, and the also position of the European Union vis-a-vis this war, and at the same time, US and other countries. So everything, in my view, for extreme right groups and activists within the countries is filtered by the also the institutional elites and the positioning of the institutional elites, extreme right elites. So in my view, the changes will be filtered by the position of, for instance, in Italy, filtered means not simply one direction, saying that if the leader support the Russian government, also the extreme right leader, also the extreme right groups will support immediately. What I want to say is that it is really filtered in a one direction or another, also in terms of opposition. So for instance, it is clear that currently in Italy, the quite moderate, not radical for sure, position of the current extreme right leader party, so Fratelli d'Italia, vis-a-vis the Ukraine war, is somehow creating a cleavage within the extreme right forces in Italy. Some of them following this moderate position of Giorgia Meloni, other strongly criticizing this. So I mean, and this is happening in my view also in other European countries. So what happens in terms of changes of the in terms of changes in the radical right milieu with regard to these international and geopolitical critical juncture is mediated by the position taken by the elites of the radical right. So again, the famous allies in power, if they are in power or in opposition. And the war is creating cleavages. As another critical juncture created cleavages before, think about the pandemic emergency and the emergence in many European countries, but also in Canada, of no-vax, anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-lockdown movements, within which the extreme right was particularly prominent, especially in some countries like Italy. You have seen from the news that also this radical right no-vax movement at one point split, and one part of the movement strongly radicalized until the results of committing this violent attack against the left-wing union CGL. Also, in this case, adopting and adapting some slogans and frames that we have seen during the Capitol Hill attack years before. So another signal of transnationalization of ideas. Another portion of the radical right was protesting against the no-vax, vaccination, no lockdown measures, but in a much more moderate way, also resembling the position, I would say, their respective elites, the Giorgia Meloni and other, and also the League at that point. So what I want to stress is that, in my view, there is potential for this external shock, have strong potential for also important dynamics within the extreme right milieu within each country, dynamics which can go in the direction of compacting and homogenizing them and strengthening them, or creating cleavages and splits also within the same organization. So, for instance, the very radical behavior of the organization Forza Nuova during the pandemic and the no-vax protest created a split, and Forza Nuova, which is a traditional organization of the extreme right in Italy, also quite well consolidated, actually split, and another group was formed. So actually, Forza Nuova lost a portion of activists because of its radical position, too much radical, too much violent. The same can happen for the war, for the Ukraine war. This is what I think. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that where there's like this convergence kind of themes here that I think leads us to very practical questions. And a particular theme, a particular thread I want to focus on in the last, looks like 10 minutes or so that we have, is getting back to these organizational dynamics. There's been, of the questions that we have here, there's many of them referred in some way or other to organizational dynamics and the challenges that has for practitioners. As someone who worked in counterterrorism operations, in fact, against this particular threat, I'm particularly interested in your answers to this. What in your mind is the greater threat? When you have a hierarchical, highly organized, violent extremist threat, or a flat, kind of leaderless, small cell individualist threat? I suppose in theory, you could say that the former is more of a potentially, at least organization, in an organizational sense, stabler. Whereas the other, I think, we could assess that description there would suggest a far more volatile threat. For counterterrorism practitioners, this is a very, very practical question. John, Alex, Manuela, perhaps going in that order, could you reflect on which you think is the more concerning threat, and therefore what the implications would be for counterterrorism practitioners?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when you look at how the U.S. government has responded to the domestic violent extremist threat and how they have understood it based on their public documents, what they go back to time and time again, when you look at public statements by the FBI director, DHS, intelligence bulletins, their near constant refrain for the past 3-4 years at this point is that REMV, right, racially, ethnically motivated violent extremists, as well as anti-government extremists who mobilize in small groups, small cells, who are motivated by a range of conspiracies and narratives pose the most significant threat in terms of mobilizing in furtherance of mass violent plots. And I think that when we look at the evidence, that's largely what has been seen, right? As we've discussed, many of the most significant acts of mass violence we've seen in the United States that have been driven by a violent extremist ideology have come not from the organized groups in the last 5, 6, 7 years. They've come from the lone actors who, even if they don't have any kind of organizational support, are still inspired, galvanized, driven down that pathway towards violence by their support for these underlying ideologies. I think, again, the program has done significant work on January 6th, the attack on the US Capitol. The consensus, I think, at this point is that that's a relatively outlier event. But even if you want to use that as a kind of lens through which to look at this, you do see the prominence and significance of the Oath Keepers, of the Proud Boys, these more formal hierarchical organizations with, these specific leaders, Enrique Tarrio, Stuart Rhodes, at the head of these organizations. But then on the back end, what you see are the successful prosecutions of both those individuals. And since January 6th, you've largely seen the disintegration of the Oath Keepers as a real, prominent force in the United States at this point in time. And I think that when you look at it from the practitioner standpoint, I think it does speak to kind of this deeper challenge that we do face in the US, which is that the counterterrorism apparatus that has been developed since 9/11 has largely been driven by the tools that we have in the toolbox, which do boil down to that foreign terrorist organization designation, which has been used with great effectiveness against Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and obviously most prominently and most recently, the Islamic State and their American supporters. And through those material support tools, through the support for those types of designated specific organizations, what you do have is a relatively robust counterterrorism framework that has been tested and has largely been successful in understanding the tempo, the mobilization, where these individuals mobilize and radicalize in furtherance of their support for those groups. And I think that where the rubber's kind of met the road here when it comes to these domestic movements is that we haven't really seen any sort of effective top-down strategy for countering these more kind of diffuse, decentralized spaces in such a way that has allowed, any kind of robust government-led framework. And so what you see instead is this kind of whack-a-mole hodgepodge approach, which has, again, worked in, scooping up and taking off the playing field the most prominent elements of these movements, Adamov and Division, the base being the most recent, but only after they engaged in numerous criminal activities, were linked to several murders, and had significant domestic terror plots, in their path. And so, for all that, I think it's clear, at least in the U.S. context, that the threat does tend to largely reside today in those kind of bottom-up diffuse movements.
Alex, your reflections on I guess your experiences in Europe.
Well, I would say,
and
following
your own recommendation to practitioners.
Sorry for that. There was a lag. Following your research model, I would say the two leaders I was introducing are charismatic pragmatists. Ideology, of course, is something like the navigational system, but the driver is something else. So they have this white supremacy ideology. They justify their actions through the white genocide, the Great Replacement, but they try not to connect themselves with neo-Nazi leaders of today or highlighting former actual Nazis from back in the day. And pragmatic, I think they follow the form follows function strategy, meaning they do what is most likely successful. So Rondo organizes or initiated, he's not actually organizing it actively. He initiated a network that is self-organizing, a decentralized open network where young right-wing extremists can train and prepare, because there is no national movement and there is no national cause. But how do you, once there is that national movement, or once there is that next January 6th, where do you get these thousands of well-trained, coordinated, angry, aggressive, combat sports trained individuals? Where do you get them? You have to prepare for that. And I think this is what the Active Club actually is. It is building a shadow army for the day X, which could be there's a national leader, a national movement that then need troops, or there is an incident again, maybe coming up in 2024, where you would rather have an organized group than the disorganized approach last time. That's my speculation, but that's my best guess. And again, Nikitin, the Russian guy in Ukraine, he's also doing what is possible to do, right? So he went into Ukraine. He also, important point, both are not siege folks. Neither Rondo nor Kapustin are accelerationists, in my understanding. They claim that they want to govern. They don't want to burn everything down and then maybe rebuild. They want to take over. So Kapustin says, I'm trying to build a safe space for white supremacists in Eastern Europe. And Rondo says, we are trying to build safe spaces for white nationalists in the United States. So that's another difference. And the decentralized network makes it hard for law enforcement to prioritize and justify intervention. So this is, I think, a smart reaction to the old school hierarchy approach. You know, the US doesn't have a domestic terrorism designation process, but if they would have one, it would likely be like the international terrorism designation process, where you need a leadership, structure, membership, right? So you can check your boxes and say, now we can designate. The Active Club White Supremacist 3.0 strategy is specifically designated to not be designated, right? Or designed to not be designated. Kapustin is not building a political movement. He's building a network of soldiers, which at some point might come all together. We will see.
Thank you, Alex. I'm going to leave the last word, I think, to John. I think it'd be interesting to conclude actually where Alex has left off with this idea of mainstreaming and its implications. John, just to wrap up, you know, Alex kind of spoke about some of the threats in Europe and this mainstreaming dynamic and its broader implications for countering the threat. Can you reflect on those dynamics in the American context?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this has been one of the real significant challenges that we've seen emerge. I mean, before January 6th, but you know, I think in terms of public awareness and, you know, I think media reporting, especially in the aftermath of January 6th, I think when you look at the mainstreaming of white supremacy and anti-Semitism, most specifically, that's really where we are seeing that lag time develop, where you are seeing kind of the counterterrorism tools fall a bit by the wayside because of a general, I think, challenge when it comes to understanding how the US government should best respond to these decentralized movements. And I think most pertinently, these narratives and grievances, right? I think that's where we see, you know, that these challenges emerge. I mean, there was just a Senate committee report out, I think today, talking about, you know, the intelligence failures leading up to January 6th and the fact that, you know, many of these plots, you know, many of the mobilization themes up in January 6th weren't planned, you know, as Alexander was saying, you know, it wasn't the siege culture guys. It wasn't these kind of, you know, fringe, closed forum, neo-fascists. It was, you know, mainstream individuals who were going to anti-mask, anti-vax protests, going to Stop the Steal protests, then posting on Facebook about how they have to take the country back, hang Mike Pence, hang Nancy Pelosi. I think, you know, when you look at the evolution of a lot of these narratives, you know, Alexander mentioned white genocide. You can look at, you know, the Great Replacement theory. You know, these are conspiracies that 5-6 years ago largely were, at least in the U.S., were largely relegated to these fringe online spaces and the kind of off the beaten path neo-Nazi movements. And today, they're being repeated on the floors of Congress. They're being used in campaign ads. They're being used on mainstream cable news shows. And I think what that really does in the U.S. context is it broadens out the aperture, right? It increases the potential for individuals who are not incredibly online, but who see this culture war rhetoric and they latch onto it. And I think that's really the kind of pressure point here that this mainstreaming has led to in the United States is that culture war rhetoric, right? It's the us versus them. If they are against us, it's because they hate our version for this country and they hate you and they hate what you stand for. And because of that, they are somehow less than you, they are less human, and therefore they are legitimate targets for political violence. And I think it's since January 6th, what you have seen is this rotating cast of right-wing conspiracies that have targeted any of these kind of outgroups. Obviously, going from January 6th, you see discourse around critical race theory, around the FBI, around the IRS, a lot of the groomer rhetoric targeting LGBTQ plus folks, and I think in each of those instances, what you see are either plots or successful attacks or disrupted plots targeting any of these outgroups, right? In the aftermath of the rhetoric around the FBI, there was the individual who tries to drive to the Cincinnati FBI field office with a nail gun and a semi-automatic rifle. This is not a domestic violent extremist who was part of some underground group for 10, 15 years. This is not someone who was overtly violent extremist, but he saw this call to arms and saw a chance to become a part of the culture war because he saw his, a congresswoman tweeting about the FBI being the enemy of the people, and he thought, this is my chance to, be a foot soldier in this culture war. And I think that that does speak to, I think, the breadth of this challenge, which is that an increasing subset of Americans are openly, happily embracing that us versus them, in-group, out-group culture war narrative, which is, not only directly leading towards potential acts of violence, successful acts of violence, but also, increasing the general disillusionment with the direction of this country, the role of democracy, the democratic processes that this country is built upon. And I think, on the other side of that coin, what that does then is, increase the potential for individuals to not just, become radicalized, but then go down that rabbit hole towards neo-fascism, towards white supremacy, towards anti-Semitism, and then actually, end up joining one of these decentralized spaces that's moving towards violence.
Alex, the culture wars, have they found their way to Europe? Are they contributing to the kind of mainstreaming issues that you've spoken about today?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of, copy and pasting from the US to Europe and the other way around for decades. So the Great Replacement originated with this title in France, right? But it is being mentioned on Fox News and other major TV stations in the US as if it would be a fact. And there is a fact category to it, right? So white majority countries are shrinking in terms of migration, diversity, plurality. So something is happening. The extremists claim, though, that there's a worldwide Jewish conspiracy behind it to kill the white race. So this is why this is tricky and why we also have to make sure that we're not creating more extremists than that are there anyway by bashing everyone who says, this feels like my country's changing. I see on the news that there's a threat against us. And on social media, I only see terrible stories, maybe, if I'm inclined to also look at terrible stories. So we have to have different toolkits. One is for extremists and terrorists who try to achieve some sort of taking over the government or burning down the society. and those in society who are overwhelmed or frustrated or scared or whatever, the change is maybe too fast. They realize that things are different than 30 or 60 years ago. And this why my approach here would be rather a scalpel approach on extremism and terrorism, identifying the core leaders, identifying their core strategies and structures, and then disrupting them in the most effective way, rather than bashing out against everyone who has a problem that society is changing. Because if we do that, suddenly we have millions of extremists, right? So this is the tricky part. Extremist strategy 101 is to provoke the government into overreacting. So the undecided feel that the government is unjust and that the fringe might have a point that this society is not worth being saved. This is 101. This is from the Islamic State to the right-wing extremists provoking overreactions. So we have to be smart about this. And this is definitely a challenge nowadays.
Thank you, Alex. John, the rest of our panelists, and of course, to the listeners today, thank you for joining us. Please do check out all the publications that have been posted there, and go to the Program on Extremism website for much more. Until next time, I'll see you later.